Thank you. I appreciate it. This conversations like this give me life. So I had no idea what I was walking into.
So, when we're talking about trauma, I think one of the things that is really hard is it's a personal experience and it's a subjective experience. And I think there are some times when we're going through trauma that we know we're going through trauma. And then there's some times that a trauma might be unfolding. We might be experiencing it, but we don't identify it in the moment as trauma.
Yeah.
But then there's really significant aftermath. And I think that can be the case with big moments in life and small moments in life. And I'm wondering if that's something you can relate to or you've.
For sure. I've experienced that in several ways. So, being in a situation or an environment where I am very aware that I'm going through trauma or I'm experiencing trauma. But then other situations where, especially now as a husband and as a father, I'm looking back on some of my childhood experiences and recognizing, like, wow, that was trauma I was going through,
Mhm.
right? And it's impacting me now, the decisions that I make as a father, as a husband, that I then need to go back and unpack so that I can make different decisions. So yeah,
Right.
that absolutely resonates with me.
And with everything that's going on in the world, you and I were talking earlier that there's the climate related disasters, there's all the oppression that's not new but continuing to surface. There's everything that's happening with democracies dissolving, right? We're coming out of this pandemic, but things were challenging well before the pandemic as well.
Yeah.
So I think part of also what is important for us to be able to keep the front of mind is that there's these collective experiences and there's these collective
Hmm.
disasters and catastrophes that are happening. And then there's so many individual ways that we can be going through our own trauma. And even if it's not to the level of trauma, overwhelm,
Yeah.
right? And that can be acute, that can be like, God forbid, something happening, just an acute incident. And it can also be over time where we're taking care of somebody who's ill for a long time, or
Sure.
there's something over time that can be really hard.
Yeah, I mean, I think about, the folks who are experiencing trauma right now um, and some of these climate disasters,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, for maybe us that are kind of on the outside of that, we're watching that through the news cycle day to day, and just, I'm imagining myself in those situations, and I think there's some level of trauma there,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But then the folks who are actually in the midst of that, and the trauma that they're experiencing, and the trauma that they're experiencing right there in that moment, but also how they're going to be dealing with that trauma over their lifetime.
Right.
Um, yeah, I mean, it makes a ton of sense that we're collectively going through a lot of these things now because of technology and how it's allowing us to communicate, connect, and see it all together in
Right.
real time. And so
Mm-hmm.
we're all going through some of that trauma at the same time
Mm-hmm.
as well. Yeah,
Yeah.
it makes sense.
And there's what you're bringing up that's so important is there's the experience of living through it yourself, and then there's the experience of bearing witness.
Yeah.
And that can be, again, that can be large scale, like we're seeing, and it can also be bearing witness to somebody struggling, your roommate at school, right? Or
Yeah.
a friend or somebody in your community.
Hmm.
So there's one's own experience of going through it, and then what it means to bear witness over time.
Yeah. What do you think the difference is between when you bear witness to something that's, external to you,
Yeah.
but um, still very impactful to you? Like, I mean, how does someone navigate? Because I'm just assuming here, but
Mm-hmm.
I think from a societal standpoint, we watch things on TV or we see things, externally, and uh, we're impacted by it.
Right.
So how does somebody navigate? Like, what conversation do you have, to navigate that? So, for instance, I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
So, the Uvalde shootings that happened in
Mm-hmm.
Texas, like, I
Mm-hmm.
was really shook by that,
Yeah.
right? Like, again, as a new father,
Right.
like, I was having a hard time comprehending what that experience was for those kids
Mm-hmm.
and for those adults, but then also thinking those kids have to go back to school,
Mm-hmm.
So I was shifted by that.
Right.
And so, how do you have a conversation about, like, I'm also impacted by this,
Right.
even though it didn't happen to me.
Right.
You know what
Yeah.
I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. You're bringing up a couple really important things. One of the things that I think can be really difficult to remember is with what we were saying earlier, it's personal and it's subjective what reaches a level of trauma, right? So there
Yeah.
can be overwhelm building, and then there can be where it reaches a level of trauma.
Mhm.
And what might totally rattle me, you could be chilling, and vice versa. And I
Yeah.
think that's why right now, particularly, I mean, I don't want to speak for other countries, but we're in the United States. Any amount of humility we can muster, any amount of grace with each other we can muster, any amount of, in Buddhism we talk about beginner's mind, to just understand that what we don't know about things is so much, even if we're close to people or even if we can imagine we can relate.
Yeah.
And I think some of that has to do with present day, what's going on. Some of it has to do, we were talking earlier about how we were raised and where we were raised. I think there's intergenerational transmission of trauma,
Mhm.
intergenerational transmission of oppression.
Absolutely.
There's all that evolving science of epigenetics.
Yeah.
And all of that ties into, like you're saying, in that moment, something that would shift something for you or rattle something for you, but might not for somebody else.
Yeah.
And that's why I think us trying to have some grace with each other, some humility with each other is really, really important.
Yeah.
And then the other piece that you're bringing up is not minimizing, right? So that experience that we can do of just like, wow, I'm being really impacted. It's hard to get out of bed after this, or I just feel super distracted, or I'm really irritable, or whatever it might be. And yes, we want to have context and perspective and gratitude in terms of, okay, it didn't happen to us, and we're not going to compare
Right.
it in that way, but still not minimize that there is a very significant impact on our nervous system,
Yeah.
on our spirit, on our mind,
Yeah.
all of that when we're bearing witness. I mean, unless you're a human who's completely disconnected, right?
Yeah. No, I think that resonates with me on a number of fronts. Number one being as a former athlete, and I would still consider myself an athlete, a competitor to that degree.
Yeah.
The common notion in that world is that you don't let things like that affect you,
Right.
right? They can't impact you
Right.
because you have to be this headstrong warrior that can go run through a wall,
Right.
right? And your emotions are secondary to whatever the task is at hand.
Right.
And I know in some realms it is important, right? Survival to a lot of degree is like you got to put some of those things to the side when you got to do what you got to do in that moment.
Right.
But as you know well enough that there's a balance,
Yeah.
right? So I'm curious about, how would you articulate what that balance is? But then also, I think from, well, let me leave it there because
Yeah.
I can get, there's much more that we can get into, but from articulating a balance thing, what is that
Right.
from a professional? What is that? How do you articulate that?
Yeah, it's really I'm interested in what you're saying I mean, there's a number of layers to what you're saying, right? There's how we're raised and how we're socialized.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're different genders, right? Like race can look different for us where we were raised in different places, but being able to take into consideration everything that means, and also ancestrally what has been passed down, if one believes in that intergenerational piece,
Yeah.
and how that contributes.
Yeah.
And then we look at, how we grow up. We look at, you went to a super intense college, you were in a super intense profession. There's a ton of headwinds, at least society. I mean, we're trying to shift things, but societally, there's a ton of headwinds for you being able to be open about your feelings and express your feelings and kind of balance that, be able to create that space for like, I can be vulnerable, also ask for help, also be super strong,
Yeah.
also be super also task at hand.
Right.
And I think historically we've been so reductive about those things,
Yeah.
right? And there's been a really flat analysis around it.
Yeah.
And all of those headwinds then combined to then, we are present moment, and you're wanting to be a father in a particular way and a partner in a particular way and just a community. I mean, you have this incredible community center you just opened, and you're not wanting all those, oppressive tropes to be involved in that
Right.
too.
Yeah. And I think I appreciate you articulating that way because you're right. When we talk about this all the time, when folks come through our community center, we want them to be seen, recognized, and loved and appreciated for just who they are when they walk through those doors.
Yeah.
Right. A welcoming place for anybody in our community, which means like they have to bring their full selves.
Right.
Trauma, perspective, all of that with them,
Right.
right? And we have to be open and welcoming and all the things.
Yeah.
So yes, I agree with you. Like there's headwinds in the sense that I grew up in an environment where, you know, emotions wasn't necessarily the first thing that you go to express what's going on with you,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and also just the environment as a competitor, that was definitely not the case.
Yeah.
But you hit on something that's really relevant to me, and I've been talking more and more about this, is the generational
Mm-hmm.
impact of trauma,
Mm-hmm.
right? Especially for, I think, for a lot of African Americans in this
Mm-hmm.
country,
Mm-hmm.
or I should say Black Americans in this
Mm-hmm.
country, um, like there is uh, an invisible pressure,
Mm-hmm.
if you will, um, that I don't know that I'm just recently becoming more aware of how to articulate what that is.
Yeah.
Um, and I do think it's generational, whether
Mm-hmm.
it's in, you talked about the genetics. I do think, and I think there's science behind this,
Mm-hmm.
that trauma actually does change your DNA,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which
Mm-hmm.
would make sense because we've evolved over time and we've had to adapt to our environments,
Right.
which means, whatever environmental trauma that we're experiencing, our bodies are shifting and changing to adapt to that, right?
Right.
So even if it's societal trauma, I think our bodies and minds are shifting to adapt to that as well. And so
Mm-hmm.
I do believe in the generational
Mm-hmm.
impact or generational trauma impact. And I don't think we talk about it enough.
Right.
I don't think that it's recognized as like a, a very valid and real reason why, some demographics are uh, maybe more hesitant to trust government,
Right.
or more paranoid about certain situations or certain environments, right?
Right.
Like it would make sense. And I
Right.
think looking at it through that lens, I've also put myself in that seat of like, why don't I feel as comfortable in certain environments? Why
Mm-hmm.
do I think a certain way? Why does my mind go and get triggered by a certain thing that I see?
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
I didn't ask for that,
Right.
but I think that's generational trauma. So not only in the genetics part of it, but
Mm-hmm.
also when you have folks who are living in that environment
Right.
or thinking that way,
Yeah.
and they're raising children
Mm-hmm.
with that thought in that environment,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's not just genetics; it's also environmental in that way.
Right.
Do you
Right.
agree? I mean,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes. Absolutely. I'm curious with what you were saying, and I think many people will be able to relate to that growing up, there wasn't a lot of support. I mean, again, we're trying to shift things,
right?
but this can depend on so many different factors that many people would say they did not grow up with a lot of support to stay connected to their full range of feelings.
Yeah,
And sometimes when we look at race, sometimes when we look at gender, sometimes when we look at class, there's specific areas that, maybe one was supported to be angry, but not to express vulnerability or sadness.
yeah.
And then, completely vice versa for other folks, right?
Mhm.
So when you moved through that experience as a child and then everything that you had going on in terms of athletics and the pressure riding on that,
Mhm.
and again going to university where you did and then having the professional career you did, how did you navigate cultivating insight around that when it wasn't, even if you had a lot of love around you,
Yeah,
when you were young and you had a deep bench of support when you were young? And
yeah.
I know you've talked about the role that other community centers and having mentors has played in your life,
Mhm.
but how did you cultivate that insight when it can be really hard if we weren't raised with that? And again, there's so many pressures countering that,
Yeah,
with like voices in your head about what it means to be who you are, a man, a black man, a black man
yeah.
in society the way you are. Like, how did you navigate that?
I would love to lie to you and say that it was intentional and that I had this plan, right? But um, I think the truth is that I've been very lucky and fortunate and blessed to have folks around me who have
Mm-hmm.
poured into me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm not shy about my relationship with therapy, with counseling.
Mm-hmm.
Like my wife and I each have individual counselors. We have a marriage counselor. I have a second counselor that's more of a, he's a pastor, so he's on
Yeah.
the spiritual side of
Yeah.
counseling as well. Um, like that has been tremendous in my evolution of understanding, first and foremost, who I am
Right.
in the world,
Right.
right? Um, but then diving deeper and understanding like, okay, what are some of these emotions? What are some of these thoughts? What are they tied to?
Right.
Whether it be historical or whatever it may be, like
Right.
really exploring that.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, that's gotten me to a point where I'm looking back on some of the maybe the cultural norms
Mm-hmm.
or even professional norms that
Right.
I'm like, yeah, that served me well in that realm of my life,
Mm-hmm.
but in order to be the best father
Right.
that I can be, that can't come with me, right?
Right.
And but also giving myself grace in that.
Yeah.
Not I have a hard time of I beat myself up a lot as a
Yeah.
competitor. I'm always trying to strive for the next milestone, and I beat myself up a lot, which again in previous realms was
Right.
beneficial to me.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to give myself more grace and understanding that, like, yes, that served me very well in the previous
Mm-hmm.
realm, but in order for me to be the next level of this,
Right.
of life, of a man in this world, um, I have to evolve from that.
Yeah.
And so giving myself grace when I fail at that, for sure.
I so appreciate you bringing that up because I think it's something like you were saying earlier that one of those places we don't talk about enough in terms of something can serve us and it can like serve us and serve us and serve us in different realms. And then it gets to a point where the conditions have changed and it's not serving us anymore.
Right.
And then it can become very destructive and
Yes.
even really, really toxic.
Yes.
And I think a key piece that you're talking about is that giving ourselves grace. I mean, maybe there are people who are excellent at being compassionate with themselves. That's not me. It's not anybody I hang out with. It's not people I know. It sounds like you can relate to that. We're
Yeah.
really hard on ourselves. We have really high expectations of ourselves.
Hmm.
Some of those voices in our head, there's nature, nurture, right? So some might be how we came into the world, and then a lot can be in terms of nature.
For sure.
The nurture around us in terms of those voices that come in and counter that
Right.
nature. But those voices of being self-deprecating, self-effacing, like there
Hmm.
being a bar that like we're never going to reach, understanding how much that ties to oppression as well, and then that contributes to more overwhelm. And I think when we can look at these times in our life of like, okay, well, whatever it is, that level of aggressiveness, did that serve me? Or that level of just being self focused, did that serve me? Whatever it might be, self preservation along the way.
Hmm.
But then when the conditions change and it's not of benefit anymore,
Yeah.
then it can be really hard to change gears,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
to understand like those conditions don't call for that anymore.
Hmm.
But it's like then we have very little experience. What does it mean then to do things
Yeah.
differently?
It could be scary, right?
Yeah, really scary.
Yeah. Terrifying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you noticed you've had support to make some of those changes? Sometimes when we shift ourselves in those ways, sometimes there's a lot of support, and then there's sometimes a lot of people invested. I mean, and you're so well known. So you've got people who might be close to you invested in how you used to be
Yeah.
or their image of you.
Yeah.
And then also you're somebody who's beloved by so many, and you've got this public persona too, where I'm sure there's a lot of people who've got a lot of opinions.
Absolutely. um, but I think it comes back to there's one of my favorite quotes is show me your friends, I'll show you your future.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard that a long time ago, and it really resonated with me, especially in my previous profession, the NFL. Like, you're right. As an entertainer, as an athlete, there are at times folks around you who benefit from the proximity that they have to you, right? And they want to continue to prop that up because it benefits them.
Mm-hmm.
And at times you can be around folks who, and I call them yes people, like people who tell you what you want to hear, not necessarily what you need to hear,
Right.
right? They don't have your best interest at heart because it's
Mm-hmm.
really about what benefits them.
Right.
Um, for whatever reason, and I think my mom and my dad were very, they modeled being thoughtful about the people around you, and they modeled it in both good and bad ways.
Mm-hmm.
Fair, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was very sensitive to that growing up.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I got in the NFL, it was very important to me that the folks that were around me, that were closest to me,
Mm-hmm.
that they were folks who challenged me
Yeah.
every day,
Mm-hmm.
right? They pushed me to be a better human being and a better man, and called me out on things when I wasn't going down the path that I was supposed to go down,
Right.
right? And my
Right.
wife talks about it. She's like, you need people around you who breathe life into you,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so the way I articulate it is I need people around me who tell me what I need to hear, not
Mm-hmm.
just what I want to hear.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right, right. And when you've then run into friction about, well, this is actually, I used to conduct myself in that way, or I used to talk in that way, talk shit in that way, right?
Yeah.
Or I used to, you know, have behavior or conduct in that way. I mean, we can all relate to these. I'm to speak for myself, not how you've been out there, right? And then we want to make changes to that,
Hmm.
right? When you've run into friction around that in terms of you shifting who you are,
Yeah.
then how have you dealt with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, um, it's an evolving answer,
Mm-hmm.
uh, because it comes in many shapes and sizes. So, for instance, like I have family members
Mm-hmm.
that, you know, I think in their eyes, they benefited from me being the sports star that I was,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and that came with a lot of negativity.
Yeah.
And so when I shifted from really focusing on being a father and a husband
Mm-hmm.
and a somewhat normal community member,
Mm-hmm.
um, there was friction there.
Yeah.
Um, but I think along the way, I was in intentional about trying to be honest with myself about who
Mm-hmm.
I was, who I wanted to be,
Mm-hmm.
even in the NFL, but then post NFL, like who am I becoming? Right.
Right.
I remember um, it was the last 2 years I was in the NFL, and I could kind of feel like some of my older teammates, they were retiring.
Mm.
Um, seeing people who I came in with in the NFL and folks who were a little bit older who I looked up to, like they're leaving the game, and I'm just like, man, like really, uh, it really dawned on me that this is not for long. Like at some
Right.
point, this is coming to an end. And so
Right.
I remember I had this journal I was writing in. I was just asking myself questions, like very general, like who are you type
Mm-hmm.
questions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I just remember like being on that trajectory 2 years before I retired. And so when I got out of the game, I
Mm-hmm.
kind of had some of this framework
Yeah.
already existing. So then when I ran up against that friction,
Mm-hmm.
I was able to compare, okay, like what is this person saying
Right.
compared to who I said that I wanted to be,
Right.
right?
Right.
So having some of that framework helped, but then obviously having a person in my life who genuinely cared about me as the
Mm-hmm.
human being, didn't care about the accolades from anything else, right? My
Mm-hmm.
wife, being my
Mm-hmm.
wife, incredible support and pillar to be able to measure, like, where I'm at in the
Right.
world. And then my family, great friends, right? We all held each other accountable to some
Mm-hmm.
degree to that. So when that friction did occur, you know, don't get me wrong, like I gave into it at times. I
Mm-hmm.
think we're all human. It's
Of
natural,
course.
right? We
Yeah.
want we want to feel loved and
Yeah.
seen and accepted. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we give into things to get that.
Yeah.
But what I realized is that when I stuck to my boundaries and um, when I was steadfast in who I believed I was and who I wanted to be, I attracted folks who were supportive of that,
Yeah.
right? And so then my network of people who were not yes people, who were people
Mm-hmm.
who actually genuinely cared about me, that grew.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's it's weird. Like I don't want to talk disparagingly about my experience in the NFL, but
Yeah.
when I left the NFL,
Mm-hmm.
that's when I felt like I was meeting really good people
Mm-hmm.
again. I
Mm-hmm.
started meeting really good people again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm so struck by what you're saying, in part the identity piece and that conditionality around it. And I think you're bringing up something that so many people struggle with in different ways, right? So you have this very specific, renowned profession and role that you were in, and the identity that comes with that. And I can only imagine the fear with the impermanence around that
Hmm.
and how fleeting it can feel. And you're what, like a blown out Achilles away from
Yeah.
all of that ending or whatever it
Yeah.
might be. And just the impermanence around that, but not like in a awesome spiritual way impermanence, that just it's so fragile,
Yeah.
right? And then I think that what you're tying that to in terms of that need to be seen and that need to feel loved, and even if it's not a deep bench of that, but we know just having some intimacy, having some folks we're connected to, right? Having some folks who can truly see us and appreciate us for who we are, not what we're doing,
Right.
right? But for who we are,
Yeah.
how important that is. And whether it is in a role like yours, whether it is somebody who their role in their community is being the super, super, super caring friend, and then they realize it's just they've been in completely unequal relationships,
Hmm.
whether it's somebody whose profession might be short lived. You can only be a surgeon for so long or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
But I feel like societally, there's so much pressure
Hmm.
on folks for very, very narrow windows of identity.
Yeah.
And I think, and I imagine you can relate to this just given the career you've had and then, your schooling and everything, it can fuel this perfectionism,
Hmm.
which is so damaging.
Yeah.
And I think part of the way that that can connect with, I mean, that's just overwhelming day to day, right? Like overwhelming day to day if we feel like our sense of people around us caring about us or our worth and value in the world being tied to something so fragile,
Hmm.
like what we're doing as opposed to who we are,
Yeah.
in and of itself, that's overwhelming.
Yep.
And one of the things I've seen over and over is when trauma happens, it really brings into sharp focus exactly what you're saying, like what you were journaling about in
Hmm.
terms of the core tenets of what matters, as opposed to these other pieces that society might recognize,
Yeah.
right? But that are not
Yeah.
steadfast. And I see it certainly with adults. I know we're both parents, and I also see it with so many kids and starting very, very, very young.
Yeah.
And with what we know in terms of, more and more, we're talking about this mental health crisis with teenagers,
Hmm.
and suicide rates are getting younger and younger with kids. And I have been at funerals of young people where their loved ones and their peers have talked about, I wish I had let them know, my classmate know, my friend know, my teammate know that I loved them and cared about them and wanted to spend time with them for who they were, not for, their performance on the field or their performance in the pool or their
Yeah.
performance in the gym. And I think we can translate that to a lot of different areas of what it means, right? To be able to have really deep rooted within us sense of who we are.
Yeah.
But that means that you have some ability to be able to discern what oppression has done
Yeah.
and what all that supremacy in society has done.
Yeah.
And then, the choices we make as a result of that.
Yeah. I mean, you've hit on so many different things, and that it would take us more than time when we have to unpack it. But I would say that, again, as a father now, I am also looking at the different aspects of how we're raising our children, and like, how do I mitigate some of these risks of this pressure, right?
Mm-hmm.
And obviously it's well documented, but I think social media is like, I know for me,
Mm-hmm.
like because my generation, we were the first generation to kind of grow up with this uh, as athletes and entertainers,
Yeah.
right? So we made a ton of mistakes, like being the guinea pigs for the rest of society.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I remember so strongly how performative I felt I had to
Yeah.
be to get that love and attention, and just the simple just feeling like I was seen, even though it was performative, so it wasn't really who I was.
Right.
And I can just imagine young people now with just everybody is so connected to it.
Mm-hmm.
That pressure to be performative,
Mm-hmm.
to in some ways, like you said, like trying to be perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's crushing.
Yeah.
And I don't want my daughters to go through that, right? And so, to your point, like I know that there's going to be at some point I don't have control over that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in the meantime, my job is to demonstrate genuine, authentic, unconditional love to my children, so that they have that backbone, they have that understanding. So no matter where they go, no matter what trauma they experience, right? They know that they are loved and that they are seen and that they have a home.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't necessarily mean like a physical
Right.
home. I mean, metaphorically, like they have a home
Right.
in their heart where they know who they are
Mm-hmm.
because they've been loved for who they are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean it's a lot and it's heavy, and I think especially when you're connecting it to trauma. My therapist, she always says that humans are created for connection.
Mm-hmm.
And I think especially when we go through trauma,
Mm-hmm.
we need those folks around us who genuinely love us, care about us, and know who we are,
Mm-hmm.
so they can breathe life into us again, remind
Right.
us who we are in the midst of that trauma, and so
Right.
that we don't get lost in the trauma.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And something you're bringing up there that I think is something we can't overstate enough is what it means to try to pace ourselves in life, that we're not so overextended. That, I mean, again, my entire work is doing trauma, disaster, catastrophe work, so I know I'm a catastrophic thinker, and there's many ways that that is super super problematic. And also, life is a lot. Right? I mean, it's a lot with what's happening in
Yeah.
terms of the climate crisis. It's a lot with what's continued to happen with oppression. It's a lot with what's happening with governments around the world. It's a lot with what's happening on so many different layers. And I think, at least again, society, you and I are in, that there's a way that we don't pace ourselves and we get really, really, really depleted.
Yeah.
And we're very, very, very over deployed. And I think then when these big waves come, and whether it's overwhelming or whether it's a single
We don't
crisis,
have the capacity to deal with it.
there's
Yeah.
no capacity to deal with it.
Yeah.
And like you're saying, what you're hoping for your daughters is that sense of home within, that sense of place that we can go back to, and those reserves
Hmm.
that we can pull on.
Yeah.
But if we're always striving for the perfectionism, if we're always striving for a bar that is, it's not even a constructive, healthy, rational bar, but it's just been put there, right? And then we've participated in it,
Hmm.
often from a very young age. There's all these ways that we're getting more and more and more depleted over time. And just, Buddhism talks about waking up to the present moment. We have enough data, we have enough information that, I mean, God willing, things go in a better direction than they're going right now. There's a chance it's not going to go in that direction. And so I think anything we can do to have that wisdom, and to have, like you're saying, be very discerning about the support around us,
Hmm.
so that we can deepen our capacity just for day to day joy, which is an act of liberation in and of
Itself.
itself,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then also for when those big waves come,
Hmm.
that we have something within us to pull on, but also that we really know that we've got an ecosystem around us that's very helpful, constructive, reliable.
Yeah. 100% agree.
Stigma. Let me ask you about stigma. You are not the only person who has had a profession like you've had, and who occupies, space in society that you do, who's willing to talk about mental health and trauma. I would say you're an outlier still, unfortunately, that there's so few folks who are willing to be really open and honest and forthcoming and revealing.
Yeah.
Any thoughts you have on where that stigma comes from, at least how you've seen it surface in your life, and do a disservice in your life? And then, of course, I want to know how you had the wherewithal, courage, capacity, insight to make a decision that you're not going to collude with that stigma anymore, and you're going to take that to a different direction.
Yeah. Don't get me wrong. Like I am, actively combating that every day still. Um, but I think there's just situations that have happened in my life where I've recognized like this, like the moment requires vulnerability. Like um, I always say, love is always the answer, and I know that can be misconstrued in a number of different ways, but I genuinely believe, regardless of the situation, if there's some compassion, if there's some empathy, that regardless of how hard the situation is, that gives you some pathway to navigate through it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I've just been in countless situations where that was the only answer,
Mm-hmm.
was to be vulnerable and to be genuinely honest and authentic with you know, what the moment required.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's impacted my family. I have a younger brother who I'm super close with, where we've had to be super vulnerable about things, right? Um, Reconciliation with my mom, with my dad,
Mm-hmm.
right? With my grandparents, and just historical context with just the world in general, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've had to be very grounded in going back and reflecting on those things and being vulnerable about, all of it. Um, it's given me the strength to have that discernment, to be able
Mm-hmm.
to make decisions that are best for not only for me but for the folks around me.
Mm-hmm.
And again, as a father, like, I should say this, as a father, but tying in the competitiveness that I have to be the best version of myself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I had to figure it out.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. There's a stigma that you can't be vulnerable, that you can't be open about your feelings and your emotions, and still be strong.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sure you agree with me with when I'm saying, and you already probably know where I'm going. But to be vulnerable is to be strong,
Yeah.
right? To open yourself, to open, yourself to, I don't even know how to articulate this, but like to open yourself up,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
It takes a level of courage, a level of vulnerability, a level of strength.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the reason that I have been compelled to continue to do it is
Mm-hmm.
because when I am vulnerable, there's a connection with other people
Mm-hmm.
that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise. Right? There's a level of understanding, there's a level of relatability, there's a level of connection that then, I may be telling my story and somebody else is feeding off of that. But then when
Mm-hmm.
they come to me and they share that they have a similar story and
Mm-hmm.
how, that experience affected them, and then we go on this journey together,
Mm-hmm.
it strengthens my humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think, to your point, the world is missing and is lacking that. We are missing that thread that's connecting our humanity to look at another person and
Mm-hmm.
recognize that this is just another human being
Right.
trying to survive and thrive on this planet.
Mm-hmm.
And that if we saw each other that way,
Mm-hmm.
just how much better the world would be.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right. I want to ask you, and only share what you're comfortable sharing. I don't think you're giving yourself enough credit in terms of choosing to be vulnerable. I hear what you're saying in terms of, the situation required it. Often when we're at those trailheads, right? I mean, one could just erect more architecture, right?
Sure.
Around your heart, around your spirit, around your soul, around your mind, and
Sure.
and front more. And I imagine there would be a lot of support for you societally to do that. And so you making such a conscious choice, even if it wasn't, like calculated in the moment,
Mhm.
but you making such a conscious choice to choose vulnerability, if you're comfortable sharing, like why go there as opposed to just which would be more comfortable, which is, so much of the current that society has had you in for so long, which is like don't do that.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and I don't know if the answer is different. I genuinely believe that I have been in situations where I wanted a specific outcome,
Mm-hmm.
and the only way to get that outcome was to be vulnerable,
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess, there's moments where I'm like, okay, I'm gonna try the vulnerability route,
Right.
right? And then the outcome was favorable,
Mm-hmm.
right? It may not have been, maybe from the outside view, it may not, wow, like, but the
Right.
depth of the outcome
Yeah.
was favorable,
Yeah.
for me and for the folks around me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I've experienced that in my marriage. I've experienced that again with my family,
Mm-hmm.
with my daughters.
Mm-hmm.
And the more and more I am vulnerable in those moments, the more affirming it is that, it is the right decision.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I would like to take the credit and say, no, I, I intentionally made the decision to be vulnerable. But the
Right.
truth is that, like, if I'm being honest, there was very challenging times in my relationship with my wife
Mm-hmm.
prior to us getting married,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I had to make a decision.
Yeah.
Do I put up that architecture and, uh, the emotional furniture, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
or do I move it out of the way and say, let's start new and let's be honest about what this space even is?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I could have gone that way, and I probably would not have been. I probably won't be. I wouldn't have been married. I would not be married to my wife today
Mm-hmm.
if that was the case.
Mm-hmm.
But had great therapists,
Mm-hmm.
had great support around me. Folks who
Mm-hmm.
said, "No, you should probably move that furniture out the way and check
Right.
out. Maybe this carpet needs to be changed,
Right.
right?"
Right.
Um, and then in doing that, now I'm married to an incredible woman. I've got three beautiful daughters, and I couldn't be happier and more thankful for the life that I have. So,
Yeah.
um, it was the requirement of the moment and the affirmation that it's worked out.
Mm-hmm. And Doug, one of the things that you're talking about is the power of just very, very, very simple, but it's so profound human connection. And folks for a long time have been talking about loneliness and how
Mhm.
damaging and how detrimental that is. And, you know, what I don't know about your career and history so much, I imagine there might have been some very disorienting times where you were surrounded by a lot of people and a whole industry, and perhaps you still felt very, very lonely.
Yeah.
And I think so many people can relate to that, where you can be a part of a big family, or you can be in a big neighborhood, or you can be in a big company, or you can be, in a big college or whatever it might be, and still feel incredibly isolated. And so with you talking about how important that is, that connection and that intimacy, and how life affirming that is.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing that we really take for granted is democracies depend on that. Like the actual operate, like having sound democracies that don't disintegrate and crumble also depend on folks having a connection and having that humanity
Healthy community.
and being able to in any way dismantle oppression and structural supremacy also depends on that.
Yeah.
And so there's these layers that I think sometimes we take for granted, kind of how what it's going to take, and that vulnerability and what it does in terms of that connection, just keeping people alive. I mean, all the research around if one is lonely, the very negative health consequences of
Yeah.
that.
We've heard the countless stories of when somebody's been married for 60 plus years, right? And then one of the partners passes away, and then the other partner passes away shortly after.
Right.
We've heard those countless stories.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You just
It's a
can't
real
withstand
thing.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I will say, like, to give you a very specific example of that, being around a lot of people and still feeling isolated or alone. I was actually there last night. I went to go give a talk to a group of folks, and the impetus for me to be a part of this group was it's the former Seattle Seahawk, right? And I knew that going in.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I got there, it was just like it's not my environment.
Mm-hmm.
Like um, I'm not a zoo animal.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a human being, and so
Mm-hmm.
I don't like taking pictures,
Mm-hmm.
right? But what I like to do is create connection with folks. I like to show up in an environment where folks are expecting the former Seattle Seahawk, but then get Doug Baldwin, the husband, the father, the community member,
Right.
right?
Right.
And I remember I was sitting in the back of this room prior to going up there and having this conversation with this group, and I just like I had to talk myself off the ledge of just leaving.
Mm-hmm.
And I basically said, I prayed. I was
Mm-hmm.
like, allow me to feel comfortable and safe enough to be my authentic self in this environment,
Mm-hmm.
and allow that to impact somebody for the good.
Mm-hmm.
And I kid you not, I went up there. I immediately, like, the first question was, so we know you from the field, but who is Doug Baldwin now? Right? And my immediate answer was, I'm Doug Baldwin, the human.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I come in here and people ask to take a picture of me, but they don't ask me. They ask the person that's going to take the picture.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They don't even look at me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like a zoo animal. Right? I don't like that. I'm a human being.
Right.
I'm here to connect with you. I'm here
Yeah.
to share my story so that somehow it resonates with you to inspire you. Whatever, like I don't even like that word, but like whatever
Yeah.
happens
Right.
here,
Of
right?
course. Yeah.
And the whole vibe of that, the time with them shifted,
Mm-hmm.
and I walked away like feeling really filled with the conversation that I had with that group because I was willing to be vulnerable
Mm-hmm.
from the very beginning. They became more vulnerable, and then the conversation became more vulnerable.
Right.
And we were like, I was there for a separate conversation. We had a totally different conversation
Mm-hmm.
that apparently everybody walked away with very happy,
Right.
right? But to your point, in that moment, prior to having that conversation, I felt very alone.
Mm-hmm.
I felt very isolated. I was
Mm-hmm.
very nervous about being in that environment. But then
Mm-hmm.
what overcame that was me being willing to be vulnerable. And
Mm-hmm.
again, like this wasn't it. Yes, maybe in this situation it was a conscious decision, but I felt like in this moment, if I'm going to do this, the only option, the only avenue to do this was to be vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And then that was the answer. That was the answer that made me feel more comfortable. I think that was the answer that shifted uh, the entire room, and it was a great experience for me and the folks who came up to me and speak afterwards. Like
Yeah.
it was a great experience for them too.
Right. Again, perhaps not giving yourself enough credit there in terms of the intentionality, because that's the other thing I'm hearing is how intentional you were in that moment to make that decision, because it is a heavier lift, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
for sure.
like being superficial, being vapid, all that's like very, very different. So I appreciate that intentionality. And I think that's the other thing, that sometimes when we're not, for whatever reason, able to be really rooted within ourselves, it can be very, very, very hard to have that intentionality.
Yeah,
And our calculus can be very, very skewed.
yeah. But I think, going back to the main topic here, I think it's vital when we're going through trauma
Mm-hmm.
that we are vulnerable, that we have the
Mm-hmm.
space to be honest about how we're feeling and what we're going through, and then also having that support system around us that is not judgmental,
Right.
that gives us that space and capacity to talk about what's going on, and then just loving us and seeing us through it,
Right.
right? Because you and I both know this trauma is going to happen,
Mm-hmm.
right? Uh, Trauma is going to happen. Like if you're alive, you are going to experience um, suffering to some degree,
Mm-hmm.
and I genuinely believe the antidote to that is love,
Mm-hmm.
but love comes from being in a group of folks who genuinely care and love and see you, right?
Right.
Um, and to your earlier point, I think our society is really missing that. And
Yeah.
especially with the amount of trauma we're going through
Mm-hmm.
and the pressures that society places on us to be perfect or to perform,
Mm-hmm.
we are missing that community, that level of community that we can fall back on, that gives us that home.
Right.
Yeah.
So, Doug, getting specific in terms of just with everything that's unfolding and all the incredible noise out there, what practices? You've mentioned a few. I know faith's very important.
Mhm.
Sounds like you've got some really wonderful support and connection one on one in your life. What other practices in your life are non negotiable to you? Like, in a really practical way, when it's hard to get out of bed in the morning, when you're
Mhm.
feeling like totally at a loss of kind of, ooh, things are a lot right now,
Yeah.
right? What practices do you employ that you find to be really helpful?
Um, Maybe not logistical practices. They're more spiritual than anything, but there's three things that I had this manual in my notes, and I read that manual every day. And basically, it's like, it's a manual for my life. And the first three things that are on that manual that I have to check off every day is number one, read your Bible. Number two, be present. And then number three, take inventory. Right. And so for me, the practice of connecting with my spirituality, knowing that, to some degree, like this world is going to come to an end at some point, right?
Mm-hmm.
So having that awareness and that understanding, and not be getting bogged down by that, but understanding that this is not my final destination,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Um, and then having the freedom then to then just be present in the
Mm-hmm.
moment and to
Mm-hmm.
experience life as it happens,
Mm-hmm.
right? But then also to be able to reflect on life as it happens and take inventory.
Right.
of, okay, how did I show up in this space? Were there things that I would want to do different? Are there things that, that I learned or that challenged what my, you know, prior beliefs prior going into that situation? So I think those three
Mm-hmm.
things, if I do those three things on a consistent basis, they're bringing me back to the basics,
Right.
right, of my humanity, of who I am, and forcing me to reflect on all of the things that I'm trying to do and how I'm trying to show up in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so those are the three things I would, I don't know if they're not tangible physical practices, I guess, if you will, but, you know, mental exercises that I
Absolutely.
do on a consistent basis.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Thank you for having this conversation with me. It really, really, really means a lot to me. So thank you so much for taking the time and
Of
for
course.
being willing. It really means so much.
I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.